Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the gloomy, perilous, and less than glamorous world of medieval assassins, those eerie individuals who slipped through darkened alleys and castle halls to alter history with a whisper and a sword. Even though they appear cool in Hollywood, being a medieval assassin was actually rather awful. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. To be clear, nobody in the Middle Ages woke up and said that they would want to stab a lord in the throat in exchange for 12 silver coins and the privilege of spending 3 days hidden in a barrel. Being an assassin was more of a last resort on the train of life gone tragically wrong than a professional choice. Not all medieval assassins were enigmatic recluses who received their training in temples on top of mountains. They could have been ex-thieves with good aim, desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, or someone so far removed from society that they could kill a guy and still go unnoticed in the census. Being wealthy did not make you an assassin. You made a hire. You were in management if you owned land, a title, or even a goat. However, congrats if you had just gotten out of debtor's prison, were known for your problem-solving skills, and were able to enter a tavern covertly. Someone, somewhere, was going to whisper a name and slide a coin purse over the table. It wasn't a fun name either. Bob the quiet turnip farmer wasn't asked to be removed. Usually it was a bishop with too much gold, a corrupt baron, or someone with a moat and 12 bodyguards. The salary? Alluring. The position? Terrible. However, there was nothing left to lose by the time someone gave it some thought. No future, no family, and absolutely no dental plan. Not to mention the complete absence of benefits. No evenings off, no pension, no fame. A shingle that stated quiet eliminations by appointment was not exactly something you could hang up. All you needed to do was keep quiet, move quickly, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living, especially not over ale at the inn. Yes, I sell carpets on the road. The discolorations? Well, pass away. Indeed, no one aspired to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. Wearing a hood and brandishing a rusty knife, they landed there after being chewed up and spat out by the world. The hero wasn't you. The villain wasn't even you. Everyone was uneasy because of you, the footnote, and you most likely didn't survive to enjoy the coin. Let's dispel the first myth completely. Assassins in the Middle Ages did not practice by candlelight in some secret monastery with sage teachers and uplifting flute music playing in the background. There was no teacher, no montage, and no motivational speech. You didn't die the first few times you attempted, so if you learned anything, it was that. The majority of assassins lacked professional training. They were frantic amateurs who could climb silently without sneezing and had a fair sense of direction. Excellent if you had military experience. That indicated that you were proficient with a knife. Otherwise, stabbing someone is rather obvious, but it takes expertise to get away with it with still having both kidneys intact, or good fortune. Usually it's just luck. There were no safety briefings, no guild orientation sessions, and no manuals. You weren't taught where nobility keep their exits, or how to recognize a body double. Wondering whether you simply sneaked back into the servants' quarters, you figured it out while dangling from a windowsill. Is it poison? It was trial and error, with a strong focus on making mistakes. It did work sometimes. Sometimes your victim simply became a little lightheaded and became more wary of his soup. You may have sipped the wrong cup at times. The medieval poison control hotline did not exist. Just a strong stomach, herbal guesses, and hope. Yes, you might have learned certain talents from mercenaries or thieves if you were lucky. I mean, lottery lucky. Perhaps you learned how to walk on cobblestones without squeaking from an elder assassin. However, mentoring wasn't common. It was uncommon and fleeting. Since assassins never retire, they vanish. Training for weapons? Ignore it. You didn't have a broadsword with you. You had whatever fit under your cloak without jingling, a knife you had stolen from a guard, and perhaps a garrote if you were feeling really ostentatious. You weren't some mysterious martial arts expert then. You were a man with quiet footsteps, rough hands, and a really bad connection with alleyways. Training did not lead to success. It was a result of survival. By killing swiftly and carelessly and then disappearing before someone could draw your face and affix it to a church door, you learnt how to kill. To put it briefly, your schooling was harsh, pragmatic, and devoid of commencement exercises, only bloodstains, bruises, and the nagging knowledge that you were largely alone. Let's discuss your first motivation for being an assassin. A coin. The coin is cold, weighty, jangly, and gloriously spendable. What drew you into this was the promise of it. But what's the truth? You were paid to tell lies. One does not seek a long-term connection when they employ an assassin. No documentation, a one-time service, and ideally no witnesses, including you, are what they seek. They give you a silver purse, half now, half after the work is finished. If they're feeling giving, that is. Here's the problem, though. After we make sure you didn't mess it up, ruin our reputation, leave a trail that points back to us, or live long enough to tell anyone about it, that's code for when the job is finished. So you perform the work. You risk your life, slip through shadows, and possibly murder a baron while he's asleep. Not poetic, not lovely. When you came back, the client ran away, apologizing profusely for that money. They try to kill you or worse. A bonus is more expensive than a knife to the gut. Furthermore, even when you do receive compensation, it is never sufficient. The 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral remorse were not worth the risk, the blood, or anything else. They nod curtly, give you a handful of coins, and remind you that you never came. Fun fact, some of the contracts were political snares. After being instructed to kill a dangerous person, you would discover that the target was a dummy with guards waiting. Congratulations! Your name was already engraved on the gallows when you entered a sting operation. Furthermore, you couldn't precisely register a complaint in court even if the sale was genuine. I want to sue Lord Edmund for violation of assassin contract, Your Honour. The court where you were the exhibit would be the only one you would see. As a result, you learned to demand upfront payment, take what you could, and never trust anyone. Your life won't be changed by the oily little scribe who vowed to do this job. Mostly by making it shorter, it did. Living on unfulfilled promises and disappearing before they broke you were the hallmarks of being an assassin. You've accepted the position. Regarding the salary, you have been misled. You will most likely perish. Let's talk about gear now. Ignore the sly video games and fantasy books. No smoke bombs, no charmed daggers, no crossbows that folded neatly into your boot, no retractable wrist blades. Anything you could take, sharpen, or conceal under a frayed cloak without making a clanking noise was your tool set. You were fortunate to have a good dagger if you were lucky enough to find a gold coin in a dead man's shoe. It is sharp, hopefully free of rust, and ideally doesn't smell like the last person you stabbed with it. It isn't elaborate or curved like a dragon's tooth. Poison. Indeed, it did exist, but it lacked the glitz of a steady drop into a goblet of wine. The majority of medieval poisons, which were derived from toad guts, minerals, or plants, were unpredictable. Some were instantaneous. For some, it took hours. After recovering from 2 days of vomiting, some made your sufferer angry and suspicious of stew. Ropes, sometimes helpful. With one, you could tie something up, strangle someone, or climb, but you'd better know how to use it quickly since nothing detracts from the scene like wrestling someone while moaning, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" Bows. Yes, it is effective. If you had one, were proficient with a gun, and weren't attempting to sneak it into a palace by posing as a flower arranger. The majority of assassinations were intimate. There's no time for graceful shooting, just brief, silent, and ideally not sloppy enough to sneak in. You also didn't have backups. Time to improvise if your sword broke, bent, or fell down a well. Tile for a slate roof, perhaps? Is your nail rusty? Worth a try. Intentionally buckle your shoes in moments of despair. You kept your tools close at hand, concealed in boots, hems, or, if necessary, within hollowed-out bread. In this line of business, your weapon was your boss, your greatest friend, and your only retirement plan, not for safety. Upgrades and gear fiddling between missions were non-existent. Your kit wasn't polished. You hoped it wouldn't turn on you in the middle of a blow, because ultimately it was not the weapon that killed. You did it, alone, ill-prepared, and supposed to work miracles with just a prayer and a spoon. They didn't hire assassins to shoot drunks in dark alleyways. You stabbed Jeff, the drowsy candle manufacturer, for no pay. Your goals were significant. Aristocrats, clergymen, soldiers, and occasionally even members of the royal family. And it was so difficult to kill those folks. The guards were the first. Dozens, not just one or two, well-fed, armored and armed. Some defended the rear, while others guarded the front. Others simply stood there, scaring you and daring you to blink incorrectly. You would spend days learning door creaks, patrol routines, and the precise number of stairs before the asthmatic night required a break. Secondly, there were walls. There were no front porches in castles. They had moats filled with venomous creatures, murder holes and gatehouses. Boiling oil and arrow slits were still a concern if you avoided falling into the water. Boiling oil, indeed. For peaks, your work description may be flambéed. The staff and servants came in third, the stable boys, scribes, and cooks. I'm only the herbalist. They'd be whispering to the guard captain before you could say it if you gave them the wrong look. Assassins were engaged in more than simply swordplay. They were also engaged in gossip. Furthermore, if it allows someone to maintain their dignity, medieval rumors spread like wildfire. And lastly, your real objective? Suspicious. With good reason. Backstaggers, relatives claiming their titles, and 36 people feigning sympathy were all around these individuals. They had a tester with them when they ate. Without 3 locks on the door, they couldn't sleep. Some even slept in rotating rooms, which were a lethal variation on musical chairs or in decoy beds. And if you hear that they're going to a feast, don't get too thrilled. They'll be inebriated, yes, but so will you. The royal guards, 3 dogs, a vigilant jester, and 50 witnesses with tankards will still need to be overcome. It could take weeks to even approach your goal, hiding in barrels, bribing a chambermaid, and posing as a servant. And you only had one chance when the time arrived. One exact, flawless, non-squeaky, non-bloody, at-night ghost vanishing moment. Or you would swing from the castle gate with a sign that said, "Nice try," and become the next public deterrent. To be honest, you probably think of a medieval assassin wearing sleek black robes, leather braces, and perhaps a mystery hood that billows in the moonlight. Truth? It appeared as though you were a sick goat herder with a secret. During the Middle Ages, disguises weren't particularly fashionable. You didn't have retractable armor or specially made cloaks. Whatever you could scrounge, you had. The remnants of a guard uniform that undoubtedly still smelled like its former owner, peasant rags, or a monk's robe that was 2 sizes too large. Blending in was the aim, but doing so meant looking like everyone else who had not had a wash in 2 weeks, hobbled from previous injuries, and twitched nervously from starvation. Because of your cloak, you didn't appear suspicious. You kept shifting your belt to conceal a cheesecloth-wrapped blade, which made you appear suspicious. And don't use masks. Guy Fawkes was not an option. The majority of facial covers only made you appear leprous, which was excellent for avoiding conversation, but awful for going to parties. You had to think quickly in case someone inquired who you were. Brother Tobias is who I am. I handle rooftop maintenance and silent prayer. Noble homes weren't full of fools, even if you got past the guards. Unfamiliar faces caught the attention of servants, particularly those who were unable to identify the cook's cat and fumbled with chamber pots. Away from getting struck with a candlestick, you were always someone I had never seen before. And congrats if your disguise was successful. Now you had to spend hours acting like you didn't see all the extremely stab-worthy people passing by. Wigs, too. They were non-existent. You were forced to smear dirt on your face, squint, and hope that no one could see that your beard was glued on with honey if you needed to appear younger or older. In actuality, you were not protected by your disguise. You were confused for about 5 minutes. You had to disappear after that, either imperceptibly or really convincingly. If anyone been able to see through it, let's just say that nobody wants to be the assassin who gets caught with a blade and a nun's garb in the bishop's laundry room, not on a feast day in particular. As an assassin in the Middle Ages, you didn't have a squad. You didn't have a handler who sent you coded scrolls and encouraging words, a smart alchemist in a hidden hideout, or a sidekick with a crossbow, a rusty dagger, crippling trust issues, and you. If there were rumors of a brotherhood of assassins, they were primarily fueled by mead and boredom in the taverns. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could genuinely rely on. Meeting a ghost was more likely than running into another professional killer looking to expand their network. What's causing the isolation? Because you survived longer in your business if fewer people knew you existed. Every touch was dangerous, every loose tongue a possible death sentence. It's possible that even your client is unaware of your true name. What if they did? You had already made plans to go. Friendship? Funny? Friends inquired. Bloodstains, bruises, and the reason you always slept with a blade beneath your pillow were all noted by lovers. You simply could not afford to settle down. Your entire life became a race for the closest sewer grate after one mistake and one person spotting you at a market. Even other criminals avoided each other. Smugglers and thieves were friendly. You were the person who makes people vanish. They viewed you as a walking liability, or worse, they were afraid of you. Nobody wanted to share stew with someone whose line of work may draw a torches-wielding mob. Additionally, don't expect pity. After silently killing a corrupt bishop, you couldn't tell anyone how difficult it was to go asleep. People assumed you were lying or dangerous if you mentioned your employment. And they were right. As a result, you kept your weapons, scars, and secrets to yourself. You sat at inns with your back to the wall in the darkest corner, your eyes always on the entrance. You never had too much to drink. You only ever spent one night there. Unless you were paid first, you didn't say your name. It was probably not your genuine one even then. Being an assassin in the Middle Ages required mastering the art of disappearance from every life you were never able to have, not only in a crowd. Suppose you accepted the position. You made a plan. The correct doorman was bought off by you. You were really good at pretending to be a chimney sweeper. Then you stopped. Perhaps the target suddenly turned around. They might have been with their kid. Perhaps your knife hand trembled like a scared squirrel when you got the shakes at the worst possible time. You know what? You've passed away. Because failure wasn't a negative performance review or a slap on the wrist for a medieval assassin. Frequently using ropes, fire, wheels, or jagged iron devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight, it was a terrible public and highly theatrical death. The entire operation would be blown if the kill was missed. After surviving, your target informed everyone that they had been the victim of a murder attempt. You were no longer a shadow all of a sudden. Every tavern wall within 30 miles had a rough sketch and a full description of you, making you a wanted man. And the guards you used to sneak by? They're inspired now. There were times when you had to worry about something other than your goal. Your client was the one. You were no longer useful if you failed. You were a liability. Someone who might be questioned, tortured, or worse, verbally abused. The first to offer you a second contract would be the same folks who paid you. On you. Furthermore, second chances were not available. No, I apologize. The blade slipped. Tomorrow I'll give it another go. You only had one chance. A single instant in time. Furthermore, the only thing you could hope for, if you blew it, was to pass very soon before anyone discovered who had hired you. Shame was another consequence of failure. The embarrassing, quiet kind. Not only did you fail to kill, you were not invisible. To be flawless. Perfection meant survival to assassins. Anything less? You might as well start practicing your last words and put a target on your back. The number of jobs you had completed was irrelevant. The fact that you were successful 12 times didn't matter. You're only as good as your last kill in this line of work. You'd better start running if you didn't get your last kill. You succeeded then. The strategy was successful. True, hit the dagger. There were no guards or screams, just a smooth plummet to the ground and a very significant somebody who was no longer there. Well done. Now, flee for your life. Because in the Middle Ages, being a successful assassin did not entail drinking wine on a rooftop as the city burned in the background. It meant running through back alleys with a dog already sniffing your trail and someone's blood on your boots. There was no post-work drink with co-workers, no victory lap, and no informal client debrief. You didn't even have time to appreciate your own work. Your new task after your blade hit was to get away from everyone who now wants to kill you in ever more creative ways. On the opposite side of town, guards are approaching, doors are locked, horses are restrained, and you are most likely bleeding. Before the kill, you had to arrange your escape, disguises, backup safe places, routes, and possibly a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't question you, because in a matter of minutes the city would be placed under lockdown. There was no desire for a scandal. Additionally, lockdown meant armed checkpoints, closed gates, and a dozen irate men with swords who had just been given your crude sketch and the words possibly armed and extremely stabby. Let's also discuss the client. They weren't going to greet you with a thank you note and a smile at a quaint bar, assuming they truly intended to pay you. They'd most likely disappear as well, because the most deadly person in the world is an assassin who has just finished a job. You were too knowledgeable. You had shown that you could enter locations that others couldn't. Therefore, even after you succeeded, you left with a huge target on your back and a coin in one hand. What did you win to? A week of pretending to be Brother Lucian, shaving your beard in the dark, sleeping in haylofts, and bribing ferry captains in an attempt to fit in with monks traveling east. Because survival does not equate to achievement, the entire game has to be restarted, under a new identity in a new place, and with even more people searching for you. You did indeed make the kill. Run like crazy now. If being a medieval assassin wasn't bad enough, poor, hounded, and sleeping in goat-smell places, you also had to cope with the incredibly inventive paranoia of those around you. Because assassins were viewed as cursed in the Middle Ages, not merely feared, you weren't just a murderer in a hood to them. Under a full moon, you were some wicked creature that smeared frog guts on your blade and talked to devils. If not, how else could you elude guards and disappear in the shadows? Back then, logic wasn't exactly a popular concept. Superstition, though, it was all over. Some people thought assassins could change their shape. Others asserted that unless you were cleansed with holy water, you were invisible. According to a well-known legend, assassins could breathe death through walls and struck agreements with woodland spirits. Imagine hearing a woman whisper, "Don't look at him, he might hex the baby," while you're strolling through a village. Your tools were suspicious too. It was obviously created in a cursed forge, as it carried a dagger with poison. Under a blood moon, you most likely mixed it with a severed toe. That wasn't chemistry, it was witchcraft. You would assume that this fear would be beneficial. People avoided you after all. The truth, however, was worse. Mobs of superstitious people don't think twice. They don't pose inquiries. They shout things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning," toss stones and start fires. People overreacted because of your reputation. Someone would murmur, "Maybe it was a shadow man, maybe it was him," if someone died suddenly from a disease, an accident, or choking on a chicken bone. Just simply being in the same village as a questionable death, you might be chased down. You had to keep moving because of that, always. If you stay too long, you'll see a priest ringing a bell and 5 irate farmers brandishing pitchforks as if they've been waiting all their lives for this moment. And if you were found in possession of anything even slightly strange, good luck. Strange currencies, dried herbs, or even an accent from another country. That was all it took for someone to light a torch, sorcerer, and shout. Being too fast, too bright, or too silent made you a threat in a society where monsters were thought to have human faces. Furthermore, according to medieval thinking, threats needed to perish as soon as possible, ideally by burning. Poison, the elegant assassin's weapon. Just a drink, a stagger, a sigh, and it's over. A silent kill with no mess, no shouting, and no steel on bone. The theory is that, in actuality, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was akin to using herbal tea and a negative attitude to win a bar brawl. Poisons were unreliable to start. Purified cyanide and a handy little tablet called fast-acting doom were not available to you. You had minerals, plants, mushrooms, and perhaps a few toads. You needed to pray, grind, and gather. Even in such case, the target might develop a stomachache and be more determined to stick with his anti-assassin guard team. No scientific measurement was made. You did not do it exactly. It was eyeballed by you. If the pinch is too small, the noble just throws up and calls off dinner. Before the first course is served, you will die from exposure if you pinch too much. Kitchens in the Middle Ages were also chaotic. You couldn't simply waltz in and add nightshade to the soup. You had to sneak in while no one was looking, bribe or pose as a cook, or, worst of all, attempt to contaminate a dish that would be consumed by a dog and 3 tasters. A dog, indeed. Furthermore, a noble victim did more than simply consume food. They handled it as though it were a military operation. From the jester to the steward, everyone sniffed, blessed, and tasted their meals. The dish had gone through more security than a royal wedding by the time it reached their plate. The target actually ate it, even if you slipped in the poison and it went undetected. What came next was completely unpredictable. Hours were needed for some toxins. For some, it took days. Your mark is giggling at a joke one minute, then clutching his tummy and insisting on seeing his astrologer the next. And did they make it out alive? Who would they blame? Not the chef, not the taster, you. The calm man with the twitching eyes and medicinal knowledge. Therefore, poisoning was ineffective. It wasn't in your advantage, it was sluggish, risky, and full of variables. What if you were apprehended? You did not die quickly. You were questioned using instruments until you admitted to poisoning everyone, even the dog and the Duke. You would think that someone would remember your name if you were able to alter history by overthrowing a despot, destroying a royal line, or putting an end to a political menace. Not at all. You committed assassination. That implied that people were never supposed to remember your name. You were a rumor at best. The quiet man who never finished his ale, a stranger with chilly eyes, or some hooded person. Even though you performed the most renowned hit of the century, you were still listed in the official records as having died mysteriously. Actually, that was the purpose. A tale wasn't what your client wanted. They desired deniability that was believable. They would be safer and less likely to be poisoned by their own assassin if fewer people knew who did it. So as soon as the job was finished, your name was buried, whether a real one was utilized at all. Your work was not signed. You didn't boast. Trophies were not kept by you. Outside of the kill moment, you didn't exist. Additionally, it was a loose end if someone did know your name. Additionally, loose ends had a very short shelf life in your line of work. And disregard honor. Silence was not rewarded with medals. For the man who used a single dagger to end a war in the middle of the night, there should be no stone monuments. A noble would commission a statue for themselves if they desired one. You get a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, in the worst-case scenario, a traitor's head on a spike. There were times when people just knew your name to curse it. You would turn into a silent cautionary tale. Avoid disobeying the king. Do you recall Lord Ulrich's fate? Indeed. And the perpetrator? Lost, similar to a ghost. It was not fame, but your legacy. Don't be afraid, just not there. You were not meant to make a mark. You were meant to disappear. And that was a deadly error, if you stayed long enough to become well known. Because heroes were remembered in the medieval world, assassins were eliminated. You made it through. You completed the task. You were even able to get payment, a wonder unto itself. All you need to do now is keep your head down, stay low, and have faith that your customer will maintain their end of the bargain and keep your name safe. Correct? False. Because there was a norm in the world of medieval assassination that was even more sacrosanct than avoiding detection. Always be wary of anyone, especially those who are paying you. Your client didn't employ you out of respect, whether they were a bishop with very loose morals, a merchant with ambition, or a noble. Since you were the sharpest tool in the shadows and they needed something terrible done, they hired you. You became a liability once the task was finished. You were too knowledgeable. You were aware of who desired the death, when, why, and perhaps even the price they were prepared to pay. Clients have even double-booked, employing one assassin to do the task and another to murder the first one right away. Just lower risk, no refunds. And it was brave of you to threaten to expose a client if you tried to blackmail them. Moreover, your last error. Because in the Middle Ages, strong individuals did not bargain with assassins. They were crushed. You might be paid and left alone if your client possessed a shred of honor, a rare species indeed. Even so, you would still have to presume that they were observing you from afar, with someone already memorizing your gait and sharpening steel. You were the shadow that couldn't remain, the one who couldn't speak. To gain trust, even achievement was insufficient. Because to them killing once meant you may kill again. And nobody wanted to be the next one, not even the person who hired you. Suppose you somehow outperformed the odds. You made it through the murders, deceptions, poisonings, and treachery. You outlived your employers, your adversaries, and very likely your own moral compass. What comes next? You're retired? Not at all. Because there were no retirement plans for assassins in the Middle Ages, no silent homes by the sea, no goodbye feasts, no pensions delivered in gold coins, and no murmurs of gratitude. You didn't settle into a quiet existence. Either you died or you disappeared. Frequently both. It was an easy problem. You were never secure. Your past didn't change even if you quit the job. You were dealing with too much blood, too many names in your memory, and too many secrets in your mind. Nobody wanted you to retire. Their goal was for you to be forgotten, which typically meant being buried. You had to live in continual worry that someone may pursue you, even if they didn't, and that's a big if. That a young, ambitious assassin had recently been hired to kill a mysterious person who had once been a threat. You changed your name then. Once more. You relocated to a village where nobody questioned you. You sold herbs, feigned a limp, and claimed to have been a guard once. You didn't sleep well, though, even then. You stayed away from crowds. You sat with your back to the entrance. You stored your dagger next to the coin pouch you never touched beneath the floorboard, because the scent of the man you earned it from was still there. You also couldn't trust yourself. There was something in your head from years of silent murders and fast escapes. You cringed at every knock on the door. You might be recognized by every stranger you meet on the way. You ceased to dream because it was risky to dream. You were incapable of love. You were unable to unwind. You were not allowed to laugh aloud. You lived as though you were a ghost masquerading as a man. In actuality, a medieval assassin had no end goal, simply a chilly, gradual decline into oblivion, constantly in motion, never stops observing, until you disappeared into the night one day and nobody saw you. Perhaps it was all you could hope for. You've most likely figured it out by now. It was not darkly romantic to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. It was not honorable. In fact, it wasn't very profitable. Wrapped in blood-stained linen and accompanied by a mob of people that wanted you dead, it was a gloomy, unappreciated, brief career. You wouldn't survive, not a week. Not even a day, perhaps. Since you would begin with incorrect presumptions, you'd be slick, in charge, and a whisper in the shadows. But in reality, you would be hungry, freezing, and just a wrong guess away from the noose. Cloaked and ready to go, you would slip into town. The stable boy you bribed for information just sold you out for a piece of bread and a mug of ale. The guards are inebriated yet prone to impulsive behavior, and your target has moved. You would stab the wrong person, stop at the wrong moment, or be noticed by someone's maid who had previously seen your face close to the church. Suddenly, you would no longer be a shadow. You would be the issue. Then what? You sprint. You're not accustomed to medieval landscape, though. The streets muck, uneven cobbles, and the ridiculously high quantity of loose hens. A guard named Thomas, who was just fired and is seeking a way to vent, tackles you after you slip and fall. And if you make it through that, after that, you have to handle the fallout. No future, no honor, and no allies. All you can expect is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false identity in a community that still believes in fairies, surrounded by mistrust murmurs and the growing realization that even if you succeed, that's the best you can hope for. You wouldn't last then. To be honest, you shouldn't attempt it, because the life of the assassin wasn't cool. It was a ruthless device that ate humans and spit out only darkness. It provided purpose without a place in the world and power without tranquility. History wasn't made by you. You took yourself off of it, and quiet was all that awaited you at the end. Nobody would doubt that stillness. because nobody initially even recalled your presence. Olympias, a Molossian princess from the untamed tribal areas of Epirus, was known as Myrtle before she became the dreaded queen of Macedonia. Whether or not her blood was actually that of heroes, one thing was certain. Her people claimed to be descended from Achilles himself. This woman was not meant to be on the periphery of history. Myrtle was surrounded by mystery and ceremony from an early age. In addition to politics, prophecy, ecstatic rituals, and a respect for the ancient gods, all influenced her upbringing. She wasn't the kind of princess who embroidered tapestries and grinned. No, she was attracted to omens, serpents, and the wild rituals of the worship of Dionysus, in which women invoked the divine in tranced states and danced barefoot in the moonlight. Her relationship with the gods was intimate rather than theatrical. She embodied rather than just worshipped. She kept sacred snakes in her apartments and even let them coil next to her in bed, according to ancient records that were probably penned by men who were both frightened and fascinated. We'll never know if this was a true statement or the kind of defamation that comes naturally to strong women. However, it remained. It made her angelic to her supporters. It made her dangerous to her enemies. The unsettling flicker of torchlight amidst the whispering of priestesses and the curled bodies of serpents was where her true power first emerged, not in a battlefield or throne room. A living oracle, she was more than simply a princess. She was a lady who had been impacted by something colder than steel and older than politics. Thus, when the vicious, intelligent, and notoriously lustful Philip II of Macedon travelled to the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he encountered not only a stunning princess but also an enigma that he was powerless to ignore. Prophecy and power collided in their marriage, which was more than just a political union, and it was rife with omens from the start. Some claimed that on the night of their wedding, lightning struck the sky. According to others, Olympias had a dream in which a thunderbolt entered her womb. It would all become folklore. But there's no denying that Olympias and Philip's union produced more than just a child. She planned to influence Alexander the Great's fate from the moment he was born. The union of Olympias and Philip II was hardly what one could anticipate from a queen who would eventually establish an empire. It was a volatile mixture of paranoia, pride, and prophecy from the start. Around 357 BCE, Philip, who was ruthless, charming, and already collecting wives like trophies, wed Olympias. She wasn't naive, but she was probably only a teenager. She recognized in Philip a man who shared her ambitions and who might possibly be a divine fit for her spiritual path. It wasn't exactly simple to enter the kingdom of Macedon. It was a nation of ambition and iron, where rulers were assassinated by brothers and cousins and quickly became enemies. However, Olympias, Epirus's priestess, entered with her head raised and her gaze already fixed on the crown. From the beginning, their marriage was troubled. Despite his political prowess, Philip was not suited for monogamy. He would later marry other women, always for power and frequently for alliances. Olympias, however, was not one to remain silent in the background. She was reputed to use rites and oracles to predict her future, and possibly Philip's, and she kept her own court and connections. And then Alexander was born. Celestial drama even surrounded that. According to legend, Olympias dreamed that her womb was struck by a thunderbolt and that her unborn child was surrounded by dancing flames without being burned. According to reports, Philip envisioned using a lion to seal his wife's womb. Indeed, a real lion. They acted as though Alexander was destined to control not just a kingdom, but the entire world, regardless of whether they actually believed these visions or made them up. However, the royal marriage became more strained even as the kid was praised. Olympias harbored animosity for Philip's previous spouses, particularly his later-life marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian. This was not only a home problem, it was dangerous. Since Cleopatra was a native of Macedonia, the local aristocracy would view any son she had as being more pure. Alexander's future was directly threatened. Olympias saw it plainly. She would use every trick, dream, ritual, and whisper she possessed to ensure that her son was not just remembered, but crowned, because the palace was more than simply a place to live. It was a battlefield. Myrtle was no longer her. No one would ascend to her son's throne without incurring her wrath, because she was now Olympias. The Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a battlefield of covert insults, political scheming, and acrimonious rivalries by the time Alexander was a teenager. Olympias was battling not only for power but also for her life. Although she was aware that there were many snakes in the court, she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip II had started to turn away from her. He was drinking more, campaigning more, and, worst of all, listening to his counsel more. His marriage to a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt, was the last straw. This Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, and one of Philip's most important generals was her uncle, Attalus. For Olympias, it was a declaration of war, not merely treachery. The wedding ceremony went horribly wrong. Attalus questioned the validity of Alexander's birth and made drunken fun of Olympias and Alexander throughout the feast. Did Olympias like to say that he was the child of a deity, or was he actually Philip's son? Olympias grabbed the myth, even though it was intended as an insult. Let them mutter, let them think Zeus touched her son. He became untouchable as a result. Alexander bounded from the banquet. Olympias retreated to Epirus and completely departed Macedon. However, her banishment was a strategy rather than a defeat. She was still princess in her native country. She could enlist help, whisper in ears, and observe the internal decay of Philip's palace. She was harmful even if she wasn't physically there. The shockwave followed. As Philip prepared to invade Persia, he was slain at his daughter's wedding. He was about to declare himself not only the king of Macedon, but also the emperor of the entire globe. The same query reverberated across all the marble hallways and halls illuminated by torches. Who was responsible? Was it the betrayed bodyguard Pausanias who did it? Was court intrigue the cause? Did Alexander do it himself? Or was it Olympias whispering quietly? Nobody was able to demonstrate it. Nobody ventured. However, a lot of people thought it was true. After all, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant child died within a few days. Some claim that Olympias herself killed them. The snake was back at the palace. Nothing was now separating her son and the crown. Olympias took action after Philip's death and Macedon's uncertainty or grieving. She acted quickly, brutally, and decisively as others frantically tried to make sense of the chaos. The young Macedonian queen and rival wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, was first removed. There are terrifying stories that suggest Olympias did more than simply have her slain. She made her death public, embarrassing, and significant. Some claim that after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter Cleopatra, was compelled to hang herself. According to some, Olympias had the infant incinerated on a funeral pyre. This is what has been decided. There was no mercy. Many mums in ancient courts refused to accept what Olympias understood. Mercy is a liability in a royal castle. Even a young rival child might lead to future conflict. Olympias had finished his defensive play. Now that Cleopatra and her lineage were gone, she could focus on gaining Alexander's crown. With little resistance, her adolescent son, who had already received Aristotelian training, was crowned king. Don't be duped, though. It was made possible by more than just his charisma or his father's legacy. Olympias was the one. She knew which adversaries to subtly eliminate, which generals to intimidate, and which aristocrats to flatter. She wasn't merely defending her son's career, she was planning it. Even Alexander himself wasn't always in agreement. According to reports, he disapproved of the violence committed on Cleopatra's relatives. He didn't stop it, though. He realized in his heart what Olympias had known all along. Blood is necessary for power. Furthermore, bloodlines were both a boon and a bane in Macedonia. Olympias started to distance herself from the public eye once her son became king. This was no retirement, however. She only moved from open blows to influence that was whispered. She stayed behind as Alexander got ready to begin his invasion of Persia, but not as a submissive queen mother, but rather as the spiritual protector of his fate. She conducted rituals on his behalf, consulted oracles, and sent him holy artifacts. Olympias saw her son's mission as more than just a military one. It was divine. Alexander had no intention of going to war. Prophecy was being fulfilled by him, and no opponent, Persian, Macedonian, or otherwise, would thwart that heavenly scheme as long as she was breathing. Her son had been crowned. The palace had been cleaned by her. She would now protect his empire. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a throne, but not without power, watching from behind the curtain with her teeth bared. She was formerly known as Queen Mother. She did, however, govern in all but name. Olympias refused to be marginalized, even though Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, was officially given regent. She was always writing to her son, warning him, offering advice, and occasionally reprimanding him. These weren't a devoted mother's charming letters. They were venomous and oracle-laced political briefings, and every syllable was read by Alexander thousands of miles away. She reminded him of his real adversaries. She questioned his companion's loyalty. She chastised him for his interest in Persian traditions, his selection of wives, and his attempt to claim divinity. No one else was brave enough to tell him these things. As a mother, or a priestess of divine will, Olympias, however, never shied away from speaking. Antipater, back in Macedon, became more and more bitter. At every stage, Olympias undermined him. She incited opposition against him by using her position, her religious authority, and her familial connections. She was influential among the nobility in Thessaly and in Epirus. With Olympias, a whisper could be more deadly than a sword, and she could spread stories like wildfire. Her messages to Alexander grew increasingly urgent in the meanwhile. She painted Antipater as a second Philip, ready to usurp and betray, and warned him of his ambition. She persisted in pressuring her son to behave, whether because she genuinely believed it or because she was afraid of losing control. But Alexander was hesitant. While he was fighting in Asia, he required Antipater to maintain peace in Greece. Thus, the gap between the general and the mother grew. Olympias observed. She waited. However, she was becoming frustrated beneath her parental care and holy garments. She hadn't fought in a palace for years to be subject to an elderly soldier. Olympias noticed fissures emerging in Alexander's empire, which spanned from the Aegean to India. He was straying from the mother and the gods who created him, taking on too much and putting too much faith in outside counsel. She thought that both she and heavenly favor were responsible for his wins. Even though the king was her own son, Olympias understood how to remind kings of their true identities in case he forgot it. In 323 BCE, Macedon did not receive the news of Alexander's death in Babylon with great fanfare. Like a dagger, it came. It was more than the death of a son for Olympias. She had spent decades creating this world, and now it was falling apart. The heavenly storm she had produced, released, and prophesied, her boy, was no more. Additionally, he had left behind disarray rather than a single, obvious heir. His powerful dominion was already beginning to fall apart. His supposed successors, the generals, were already splitting it up like jackals over a dead body. Antipater, who had little affection for Olympias, continued to rule both Macedonia and Greece. Even worse, opposing generals were vying for the marriage of Alexander's sister, her daughter Cleopatra, each attempting to use her ancestry as a claim to the throne. Olympias anticipated it. There was no chance of civil war. It was unavoidable, and she would have to do something again. However, Alexander was no longer with her. Rather, she had his lineage, including his infant son, Alexander IV, who was born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had wed. Still in Macedon, Roxana was at risk. Even more so was the boy. Olympias realized that the baby was the final authentic remnant of her son's heritage. He became a target as a result. However, it also turned him into a weapon. With the intention of protecting Roxana and the boy, she joined forces with them and used the child's birthright to establish her own claim in the political sphere. However, things were changing. The generals who used to bow down to Alexander were not interested in bowing down to his mother or widow. Now they had aspirations, resentments, and armies. Olympias remained unflinching. She had encountered monarchs, traitors, and snakes. She wouldn't be intimidated by a few warlords brandishing stolen spears and crowns. So she made a plan. She waited. She saw Antipater pass away and be replaced by his son Cassander, who had no patience for the old queen's antics and had ice in his veins. The collision between these two forces was inevitable. The cold-eyed usurper who wanted her buried, and Alexander's serpent mother. Alexander had left. However, his shadow continued to move. Olympias was still curled up inside it, poised to attack. As Alexander's empire dissolved into civil strife years after his death, Olympias took her boldest action to yet. She returned to Macedon as a political force of heavenly wrath, rather than as a distraught mother. They had broken the regency. The son of her former adversary Antipater, Cassander, was assuming control. Additionally, Roxana and little Alexander IV were essentially put in jail. The writing on the wall was visible to Olympias. Her grandson would disappear like a shadow at sunset if she did not take action right away. She therefore struck a bargain with Polyperchon, an elderly commander who still had a glimmer of genuine power. Olympias would come back to reign, not to beg. She led an army into Macedon with the support of Polyperchon. And everything changed the instant her boots struck the ground at home. The gates of towns opened, soldiers joined her cause, even some of her former adversaries paused. Even at her advanced age, Olympias's name still made people take notice. Then she got her revenge. She pursued Cassander's loyalists one by one. She also ordered the killing of Philip III Aridaeus, the puppet monarch, and mentally challenged half-brother of Alexander when she eventually apprehended him. Some sources claim that Eurydice, his wife, was taken prisoner and given the chance to commit suicide. Olympias had her strangled after she refused. Under the guise of royal formality, it was cruelty. Ever the dramatist, Olympias set the setting as if she were a goddess administering justice. Her message was unambiguous. Only Alexander's lineage was entitled to power. The others were all actors. Olympias held the kingdom in her hands for a single, flaming instant. The dynasty had been reinstated by her, She had exacted revenge on betrayers. She had served as a reminder to Macedon of what it looked like for a woman with nothing left to lose to wield royal power. In Macedonia, however, power was like fire in parched grass, and Cassander remained out there, waiting, calculating. He came back with a bang. His army was larger than hers, he had more resources, and he was colder in his cruelty. She started to lose the support of her allies. Polyperchon's power diminished. The tide shifted. Olympias, now alone in Pydna's castle, watched as her adversaries drew closer. The match had been lighted by her. Macedon was ablaze. Her adversaries were at the gates now, and there was a lot of smoke. Once the most dreaded lady in antiquity, Olympias was now under siege in Pydna, a coastal castle, alone, isolated, and encircled by Cassander's troops who had come to complete the task his father had begun. Olympias, however, did not plead. She didn't beg. She bore the siege like a statue sculpted from divine anger for almost a year. There wasn't enough food, illnesses spread, the allies disappeared. She yet retained the same unwavering presence that had previously shook rulers behind the fortress walls. She portrayed herself as the mother of a god, not a prisoner, right up until the end. Cassander, ever wary, paused. He was aware that killing Olympias was risky. She still wore a myth-like armor about her. Alexander the Great was still her child. It could feel like heresy to strike her down. He thus offered to keep her safe. He assured her that her life would be spared if she surrendered. Olympias was wiser. Too many royal promises had been shattered in her eyes. Hunger, however, was no longer merely an inconvenience. Death was the cause. Her garrison shattered. Her supporters gave up. Olympias, who remained unyielding till the end, was ultimately turned over to her adversaries. She wasn't killed by Cassander. That would be too easy and too forgiving. Rather, he gave her to the relatives of the people she had put to death when she briefly regained control. Let them make the final decision for her. She was given a death sentence. Here's the catch, though. Nobody had the courage to deliver the first stroke when the executioners arrived. Tall, silent, and royal, Olympias stared at them through the smoke like an oracle. They were Macedonian. They had heard about her snakes, visions, and ceremonies since they were young. Her son had formerly been praised by them as a living deity, and now here she was, a slender old woman shrouded in legend, and not a man dared to strike the sword. As a result, Cassander dispatched strangers, foreigners, and those who had no recollection of her authority, just commands to obey. As a result, Olympias was ultimately defeated in silence rather than with fanfare or honor. With her passing, Alexander's lineage lost all significant influence. The last remnant of an empire built on heavenly ambition was extinguished along with it. However, Olympias left a legacy even after she passed away, and the Serpent Queen would live on in history. Olympias was executed by her former subjects, unarmed and abandoned in the dust rather than on a throne. History, however, is peculiar. Those who die in silk sheets are not usually the ones who benefit from it. It occasionally hisses in remembrance of those who died. Furthermore, Olympias was never intended for a tranquil past. Throughout her life, she had used prophecy as a shield and motherhood as a sword. She was more than just Alexander the Great's mother. She played a part in planning his ascent. Without her, the myth of the divine infant would not exist, nor would there be any lion and thunderbolt whispering rites, or the brutal extermination of rivals that made way for a youthful king to dominate the known world. Not only did Olympias create an empire, but she also used her claws to protect it. Olympias, however, distinguishes out even among the most brutal dynasties of antiquity. She didn't ride into battle like Boudicca or lead armies in the field like Cleopatra. Her battleground was more subdued and icy. It was a world of oracles, priestesses, political marriages, and poison goblets. She was aware of the influence of terror. More significantly, she recognized the influence of belief. She may have even been convinced that her son was heavenly herself. Her adversaries accused her of being a manipulator, a witch, a killer, and they were correct. Olympias embodied all of those qualities and more. She grew up in a harsh society that valued cunning over kindness, and she was taught early on that mercy was a luxury that queens could not afford. She was mythologized and demonized in the centuries that followed. She was dubbed a visionary by some and a villain by others. However, no historian, ancient or contemporary, could dismiss her as insignificant. Always in the background, always just beyond the curtain, she plagued Alexander's legacy like a ghost, and perhaps she was meant to be there. She is a story in her own right, not a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's tale. The woman who outlived gods, slept next to snakes, and encased herself in prophecy. Olympia's legacy lives on, even if her bones have long since turned to dust. She remains coiled in the dark, waiting in every story of vicious queens, every hint of blood-borne fate, and in every myth-based kingdom. A ruin that seems more like a dream than a real location may be found on the sun-bleached island of Crete, a few kilometers south of the contemporary city of Heraklion. Stairs lead nowhere, chambers twist and double back, and stone passageways run in all directions. Even now, it's simple to lose your sense of direction. This location is Knossos, the center of Minoan culture and the purported source of the labyrinth of the Minotaur, one of the most enduring myths in human history. However, a palace existed before a legend, an unusual palace. Knossos, which was constructed in 1900 BCE and grew over the course of several centuries, was more than just a royal home. It was a whole city. With more than 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and maybe the world's first flushing toilets, it occupied around 150,000 square feet. It had a complex air circulation system, multi-story residences, and running water. This was a masterpiece of architecture, not a rudimentary castle. To contemporary archaeologists, Knossos appears to be a well-organized mess. It was likely magical to ancient visitors. Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, was the one who introduced Knossos to the modern world. After excavating the site in the early 1900s, Evans was immediately persuaded that this was where the Greek labyrinth story originated. The architecture was very symbolic, the arrangement confusing, and everywhere he looked he saw bull patterns etched into stone, painted on walls, or fashioned into small golden charms. After all, the Minoans revered the bull. Evans even went so far as to give the civilization the name of Minos, the legendary ruler. Regardless of Minos's veracity, his tale became inextricably linked to the ruins. Here's the twist, though. No one has discovered a real labyrinth. No jail cells, no half-man monster, no underground labyrinth. Instead, we have something much more enigmatic. A metropolis with layers, wings, and loops that are purposefully challenging to explore. Additionally, the distinction between mythology and history becomes increasingly hazy the further you go. Thus, the question still stands. Was the palace the monster, or did the Minotaur originate from these walls? Knossos may be difficult to answer, but it excels at forcing us to think critically. Like the ruin, the myth is well known, a hideous hybrid of a bull and a man confined in a maze so intricate that no one ever managed to escape. With the help of Princess Ariadne's guile and a ball of thread, only the Athenian hero Theseus was able to defeat the beast and make his getaway. But why a labyrinth? And where did this narrative originate? According to the earliest myths, King Minos, the strongman who ruled over Crete, required 7 sons and 7 girls as a yearly tribute from Athens. The Minotaur, a creature created out of shame and divine wrath, was fed these poor souls. The Minotaur, imprisoned in an underground labyrinth, represented the vicious side of power that lies underneath its majesty. Crete had long been associated with luxury, mystery, and terror for the ancient Greeks. The Minoans, its seafaring inhabitants, were viewed as both sophisticated and foreign. Their palaces were unlike anything on the continent. Their artwork featured weird gods, and their rites included bull leaping. A Greek visitor in 1000 BCE would have thought Knossos was an other planet. In Minoan culture, the bull itself was considered sacrosanct. In ceremonial demonstrations, young men and women are depicted in frescoes leaping over charging bulls. On altars and rooftops, stylized bullhorns known as horns of consecration are displayed. The elements of a legend start to come together when you combine this with a palace that has the feel of a labyrinth. However, what if the Minotaur was more than a mere monster? Could it have been a metaphor? According to some academics, the story recalls the Cretan hegemony over the Aegean, when Athens actually honored a more powerful foreign force. The labyrinth might represent the Minotaur, the untamed, terrible force that underpinned Minoan dominance, as well as the political captivity of weaker kingdoms. Others contend that it is more psychological, with the labyrinth representing the unconscious mind, the Minotaur representing our unconscious desires, and Theseus, the hero, fearlessly venturing into the night while being led just by recollection. Nevertheless, Knossos is still entangled in the myth. Without a monster or Ariadne, the palace is the closest thing we've yet discovered to a true labyrinth. But maybe something more profound. The history was begging to become myth, not only a tale reverberating through time. One of the first highly developed communities in Europe was the Minoan civilization, which existed long before Sparta polished its spears or Athens constructed its marble temples. They dominated via trade, art, and what appears to be an almost miraculous command of construction rather than conquest. Knossos, a palace that served as a center of culture, ritual, and the economy, in addition to being the residence of royalty, was at the center of their power. Between 2600 and 1400 BCE, the Minoans were at their height. They established a vast trading network based on Crete that extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the far-off coasts of Spain. Like stealthy darts, their ships sliced through the Mediterranean, transporting luxury items, saffron, bronze, and ceramics. More than guns, their wealth came from the relationships they cultivated rather than the size of their armies. The most notable aspect of Minoan culture is the contrast with that of its later Greek counterparts. Instead of glorifying conflict or divine retribution, their artwork praised nature, animals, and the fluidity of human movement. Frescoes depict athletes jumping over bulls, dolphins, and dancers. Even their goddesses are distinct, strong, bare-breasted beings who frequently carry snakes, which are representations of protection, fertility, or metamorphosis. Knossos, a complex in a lush valley rather than a castle on a hill, was at the center of it all. Its lack of substantial defensive walls indicates that the Minoans either felt safe on their island or that they were powerful enough to not need defense. They were architecturally confident. A society much ahead of its time was suggested by multi-story structures, colonnaded courtyards, and sophisticated plumbing systems. Despite their brilliance, the Minoans did not leave any written documents that could be read. Even now, their major script, Linear A, cannot be read. What they termed themselves is unknown to us. Their monarchs' beliefs, their prayers, and the actual events that took place within the walls of Knossos are all unknown to us. We only have their art, their ruins, and their influence, which the Mycenaeans eventually assimilated and which is reflected in Greek mythology. The Minoans were masterminds of mystery as well as palace construction. Furthermore, Knossos was more than just a structure. It was the center of a civilization that briefly glowed on the Aegean like sunlight before fading away. However, some claim that their echo is still lost in the maze. Walking around Knossos is like traveling back in time, layered, perplexing, lovely moment. The design is what overwhelms you, not just the size. Stairs spiral into shadows or abruptly emerge into bright courtyards, hallways split and disappear, light wells pierce the center of the building, and rooms lead to other rooms. Over 1,000 chambers, some little, some large, filled the structure, which was believed to measure 150,000 square feet in size. These chambers weren't haphazardly arranged, they had a purpose. A wide central courtyard surrounded workshops, storage areas, shrines, residences, and throne rooms that might have been used for bull-leaping rituals or public celebrations. Using both man-made terraces and natural slopes, the palace was constructed on several levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 floors in certain areas. You would require memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus to get through it without getting lost. However, beneath all of this seeming disorder lies a tremendous intelligence. The Minoans were adept at passive ventilation, using open stairwells and air shafts to cool chambers. Their toilets flushed long before Rome made it a fad, and they used clay pipes to channel rainwater. The throne room, so named because of the alabaster chair set into the wall and flanked by benches, is one of the most recognizable spaces. It is surrounded with frescoes of legendary protectors known as griffins. Was this a priest-king's home, a room of a goddess, a court of worship? Nobody is positive. Additionally, the walls use color to communicate. Bright frescoes depict teenagers jumping bulls in midair, women wearing sophisticated flounced skirts with naked chests, and dolphins swimming over bathtubs. The art was identity, not only ornamentation, natural, fluid, and closely related to the sea and the earth. Nevertheless, Knossos starts to become more confused the further you go. There are certain sections that appear purposefully complicated, as if they were meant to be confusing. Perhaps that is where the legend of the labyrinth originated. It was a castle that felt alive, not a jail for monsters, a structure that evoked wonder, custom, and a hint of terror. No mythological animals, no sealed doors. It was just designed to make you wonder where you were and what might be around the bend. Knossos was more than just a royal home or administrative hub. Rich in myth, ritual, and heavenly mystery, it was a house of worship and an architectural manifestation of the Minoan spirit. There are no marble shrines to Athena or tall columns to Zeus, in contrast to later Greek temples. Rather, Knossos' spiritual realm is more subtly incorporated into the structure itself. Shrines can be found hiding in corners. Like holy sentinels, pillars rise. Rooftops and altars are adorned with stylized, sculpted, and symbolic horns. The bull symbol is prevalent throughout, implying a strong bond between devotion, the natural world, and this animal of great reverence. The bull didn't appear to frighten the Minoans, they rejoiced. There is more to the well-known bull-leaping fresco in Knossos than merely sports art. It might show a religious ceremony. Young men and women engaged in a dance of grace and danger as they vaulted over a rushing bull. Sport wasn't involved. It was a form of religious theatre, a symbolic victory over chaos, or perhaps a tribute to the gods. Then there are the goddesses of snakes. The snake goddess figurines, one of the most famous Minoan artifacts, were found in storerooms beneath the palace. These figures exude strength, bare-breasted, arms outstretched, and snakes coiling in their hands or around their bodies. They are not idols of submission, they are protectors of fertility, the home, and possibly even life itself. Snakes were both earthly and underworld creatures that represented mystery, rebirth, and renewal to the Minoans. The rooms in which these items were discovered suggest ritual areas or domestic shrines, peaceful, hallowed nooks tucked away in the busy center of the palace. When combined with the altars, horns, frescoes, and winding passageways, the entire complex starts to resemble a ceremonial machine, a building designed not just for human habitation, but also for spiritual communication. Because the palace was originally a temple, Knossos does not have a central temple. Its structure, artwork, and design all reflected a spiritual vision in which there were no distinctions between the sacred and the secular. Every echo in the stone rooms might have previously been a muttered prayer. A corridor could become a path to the gods, and myth was architecture here. Knossos was home to gods as well as humans. Knossos was a symbol of wealth, creativity, and cultural sophistication for ages. Then, however, something unexpected happened that no one can adequately explain. The Minoan civilization that once controlled the seas had disappeared like mist over the Aegean by 1400 BCE, leaving the palace deserted and the frescoes to deteriorate. What then took place? There are several theories. Some suggest nature. One of the biggest explosions in human history occurred on the volcanic island of Thera, which is now part of Santorini, around 1600 BCE. Because the explosion was so large, it probably resulted in tsunamis that destroyed farms and ports throughout the northern shore of Crete. It's possible that ash clouds obscured the light, strangling crops and altering the environment. Even though Knossos wasn't destroyed right away, the economic, political, and spiritual roots might have been rocked by the aftermath of Thera's eruption. Others turned to war. By 1450 BCE, mainland Greeks known as the Mycenaeans might have exploited Minoan vulnerability. Knossos may have been briefly reoccupied according to archaeological data, but the culture had evolved, the martial arts evolved. Mycenaean scribes adopted Linear B in favor of Linear A, the Minoan script. Once teeming with bull dancers and snake goddesses, the castle now spoke in an alien dialect. Some academics think that rather than capturing the island all at once, the Mycenaeans progressively assimilated it through trade, influence, and eventually rule. Others contend that the failure of the elite, political instability, civil unrest, or internal collapse might have had an equal contribution. What is remarkable, however, is the lack of violence shown in the wreckage. No traces of mass killing, no burnt skeletons. Knossos did not shout when he fell. With a whisper, it descended. Simply put, the great palatial system came to an end. The ceremonies ceased, the chambers were silent, and nature gradually returned. Knossos was already an ancient myth, a memory entwined with tales of monarchs, monsters, and labyrinths when Homer sung of Crete in his epics. Perhaps that is appropriate, given that Knossos was destroyed by more than just an invasion or eruption. Time passed, and everything great, no matter how lovely, finally crumbles under the weight of new empires. However, the bones are still there, and if you listen carefully, you can still hear the maze humming beneath the ground. Knossos was buried beneath the Cretan soil for thousands of years, just another stone mound that had been lost to time. Its name had been forgotten, its tales had been warped, and its walls had been engulfed by dust and olive fields, until one man made the decision to follow a legend, that is. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he reimagined Knossos rather than merely rediscovering it. The land covering the ancient ruins was bought in 1900 by Evans, a British archaeologist who loved Homeric mythology and had a flair for theatre. Strange seals and artifacts had been discovered by local farmers, indicating that something massive was hiding beneath their feet. Evans got to work. His discovery will profoundly alter Aegean history. He discovered a palace so large, intricate, and sophisticated that he was certain it was the legendary residence of King Minos. He believed that the site's frescoes, horns, and overall architectural oddity all pointed to the same thing: the maze. Evans was a storyteller, sometimes a contentious one, in addition to being an archaeologist. In honor of Minos, he called the people who constructed Knossos the Minoans. He repaired portions of the palace using reinforced concrete, reproduced frescoes, and deciphered symbols, actions that have elicited both praise and criticism. At Knossos, what you see today is a combination of Edwardian creativity and old ruin. Some call it visionary, while others label it vandalism. Nevertheless, Evans took a risk that no one else had. Knossos was revived by him. He offered Europe a glimpse of a Bronze Age civilization of beauty, mystery, and marine grace that predates classical Greece by a great margin. In addition, he discovered the unsolved Linear A script, which raised fresh concerns about literacy, language, and the boundaries of our historical knowledge. Evans did more than just dig up stones, though. He brought a myth back to life and made historians face the reality that beneath the myth of the labyrinth, there was something real, something intricate, something very human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that vanished into the shadows, and a man who peeled back the earth to find a tale that was more beautiful and strange than he had ever dreamed. 3,000 years had passed since Knossos's last sleep. It was awakened by Evans ringing the bell. When you stroll around Knossos, you're experiencing more than simply architecture. You're experiencing a symbolic language. There are patterns, carvings, and frescoes everywhere. However, the Rosetta Stone was not left to us by the Minoans. Linear A, their principal script, is still unintelligible. We must thus observe their thoughts concealed in patterns, carved into walls and painted over plaster, rather than interpreting them. What did they intend to communicate specifically? There is nothing like the art of Knossos in the ancient world. Not a single ruler or battle-hardened warrior is invoked, nor is there any fixation on war. Rather, we discover nature, holy bulls, lilies in blossom, jumping dolphins, and birds in flight. The humans are graceful, slender, and frequently engage in rituals or dance. There is beauty and rhythm even in circumstances that imply peril. Conquests were not being documented by the Minoans. They were commemorating cycles, life, and perhaps even cosmic order. However, the double axe, or lebris, is the most recognizable emblem. The double axe, which can be seen all around Knossos in shrines, on frescoes, and even carved into stones, is thought to be a religious sign that may be connected to feminine divinity or the cycles of the heavens. According to some, the word labris may actually be derived from the word labyrinth, meaning that the labyrinth is a house of the double axe, a sacred sanctuary rather than a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, which are bull horns that have been styled and positioned on altars and walls. These might have used as religious markers to distinguish between holy and secular areas. It is evident that the animal had profound spiritual significance when combined with the frequent representations of bulls and bull-leaping customs. Nobody can agree on whether it symbolized a divine presence, chaos, fecundity, or nature. The bull, however, is everywhere. Knossos's design might perhaps have symbolic significance. Some archaeologists think it was constructed to reflect seasonal or astronomical patterns in addition to its intended use. Instead of being a real prison, its twisting hallways and nestled rooms can symbolize a journey through life, through death, through the underworld, a spiritual labyrinth. Every notion, however, straddles the fine line between imagination and understanding in the absence of a decoded script. We must make our own interpretations because the Minoans used symbols rather than narratives. Knossos, what are you saying? We see the pictures and hear the rhythms, but what does it mean? Just like a thread unraveling into myth, it is still just out of reach. Yes, Knossos is a ruin, but it feels alive. If you go through its halls today, you'll feel a hum just below the surface. Not ghosts or gods, but the echoes of myths, lives, and unanswerable questions. Knossos still traps us in its labyrinth thousands of years after it fell. Its shadow inspires writers to create fresh stories, archaeologists to delve for answers, and tourists to stroll through its halls. The atmosphere of the labyrinth is genuine, even though the Minotaur is a fable. Who ruled Knossos is unknown to us. The names of its priests, kings and queens are unknown to us. We know they valued beauty, even though we don't know the laws they lived by or the prayers they said. We are aware that they revered nature. We are aware that they were the first to grasp the harmony between art and architecture, between ceremony and reality. Knossos existed before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the temples of the Hebrews or the palaces of the Persians. Perhaps the labyrinth is a palace that doubled as a city that doubled as a temple, and a temple that might have doubled as a narrative. It is a story etched in stone, a fable in architectural form, rather than a jail or a conundrum. The myth of the Minotaur wasn't created overnight. It originated here, from the bewilderment of its hallways, the wonder it evoked in generations who attempted to understand it, and the veneration of its bull ceremonies. We transformed it into archaeology, and the Greeks transformed it into a tale. But, at its heart, Knossos has always been both. Even if we may now explore its ruins in the middle of the day, take pictures, make maps, and even recreate its frescoes, the mystery remains. The distinction between mythology and reality continues to glimmer like heat on stone. Because Knossos doesn't provide us with all the answers, perhaps that is why it endures. It serves as a reminder that sometimes history is supposed to be felt rather than solved, and that Knossos, ancient, twisted, and only partially remembered, is more than just a location on a map. It is a riddle that gets deeper with each step. We're all still following the thread, just like Theseus. The engineers of antiquity were highly skilled. Handheld rams were the first. Like crazy lumberjacks, groups of soldiers just lifted a tree trunk and smashed it on enemy defenses. However, the battering ram changed over time. Engineers realized that the ram was transformed from a tool into a terrifying weapon when it was mounted inside a wheeled frame, frequently with a roof, to shield the crew from boiling oil and arrows. Rams were transformed into psychological weapons by the Assyrians, who were experts at siege warfare. Their siege towers combined archer platforms with rams, so defenders were constantly being fired upon while a city's gates were being destroyed. Rams with pointed iron tips are depicted in relief carvings from Nineveh, rolling up to the gates of disobedient cities like lumbering demons of destruction. They were destroying more than just the front door. Rams were frequently employed to penetrate wall weaknesses, destroy watchtowers, or completely topple gatehouses. One thing was clear from their presence: give up, or watch your defenses fall apart like stale bread. The Romans perfected them, and the Greeks polished them. Large rams, known as Ares, which is Latin for ram, were constructed by Roman engineers and hung from chains or ropes inside vast siege bunkers. It was believed that the rhythm of their swinging beams sounded like thunder rolling on stone, and some were so large that they required dozens of workers to operate. Despite their strength, battering rams required a great deal of collaboration. In addition to protecting the ram from burning projectiles, stones, and other noxious materials thrown from above, operators had to keep the ram swinging in unison. A dead ram was one that had halted. However, once a battering ram really got rolling, it was impossible to halt. Human masonry versus wooden muscle. It was the beginning of engineers' use of weaponized ancient physics to make walls cry. The catapult was the tactician if the battering ram was the brute. Catapult struck from a distance, hurling not only stones but also fear. This contrasted with the close-up rams. Being the first actual pieces of artillery in military history, they transformed siege warfare by using physics as a weapon in ways that the adversary found nearly mystical. Around the 4th century BCE, the first catapults were invented in Greece by bright minds who wished to give combat more range and momentum. The first torsion-powered catapults, which used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs were commissioned by Dionysius I of Syracuse, a tyrant with a penchant for avant-garde violence. These weren't huge slingshots, they were exact tools of terror during the siege. Their mechanics were the genius. Engineers discovered that they could store vast amounts of potential energy by tightly twisting ropes, which were frequently constructed of animal sinew. This force might launch javelins, stones, or even fire missiles hundreds of meters when it is released. The two primary varieties rapidly changed: the stone-throwing catapult, which threw boulders over walls or straight into fortifications, and the ballista, which fired enormous bolts like a big crossbow. Then came the Roman engineers, who were always able to improve on Greek ideas. They created portable siege engines for professional armies and catapults that could be disassembled, loaded onto carts, and reassembled on location. Certain Roman catapults were able to shoot 60-pound stones at amazing speeds, blasting through battlements, wooden gates, and sometimes unlucky soldiers. Catapults were used for purposes other than devastation. Their focus was on show. They were utilized, sometimes literally, to convey messages by ancient generals. To spread dread and sickness, corpses were thrown over walls. To break morale, severed heads were thrown into beleaguered communities. In one horrifying instance, an early kind of biological warfare involved firing infected bodies into enemy territory. But there were problems with catapults. They needed experienced personnel, were heavy, and might be rendered ineffective by unfavorable terrain. However, if correctly positioned, they could safely hammer a metropolis into submission. For the first time in history, cities understood that their sturdy stone walls needed to resist the heavens as well as a ram, because suddenly there was flying destruction. The trebuchet was magnificent if the catapult was ingenious. It was the undeniable monarch of medieval siege warfare, tall, creaking, and menacing. It was more than just a weapon when it first emerged on the battlefield. It was a declaration. "Your walls mean nothing," it said. The trebuchet relied on gravity as opposed to its cousins that were powered by tension. Its basic idea was a long swinging arm with a sling on one end and a hefty counterweight on the other, fixed on a strong frame. Lift the weight, let it fall, and the arm would spin around, launching the lethal payload and sling past enemy defenses in a high arc. Devastating, accurate, and predictable, it was controlled destruction. The Chinese employed early attraction models as early as the 4th century BCE, when manpower took the role of counterweights, and this is where the trebuchet got its start. However, in the 12th century, maybe through Byzantine or Muslim intermediates, the counterweight trebuchet, the form that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged. The design quickly spread throughout castles and crusades in Europe when it was acquired. It was incredible power. Projectiles weighing 300 pounds may be launched over 300 meters by a sturdy trebuchet. Furniture-sized stones would smash through walls, smash into turrets, or destroy enemy morale. The arc, however, was where the true magic was. Trebuchets, as opposed to catapults, were able to skillfully launch missiles over walls. This implied that they were striking inside supply stores, barracks, and courtyards, in addition to destroying defenses. It wasn't just stones either. Diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime, blind defenders, and even insults or messages wrapped inside boulders were all flung using trebuchets. According to one version, Warwolf was a trebuchet so large that the enemy gave up before it was even fired during the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. In order to test the mechanism, the king declined to accept the surrender. However, despite its destructive power, the trebuchet was not swift. It required expert engineers and took hours to create and minutes to reload. However, it was unique among siege weapons in that it was a combination of psychological horror, force, and range. It resembled a slow-motion hammer from the sky in the Middle Ages. Cities held their breath when that counterweight fell. While battering rams destroyed the gates and distant catapults launched, siege towers adopted a more intimate strategy. They dropped off armed intruders as they rolled straight up to the front door of the enemy. Picture a timber skyscraper on wheels, armed with archers and spearmen, and covered in damp skins to keep fire at bay. That was the siege tower, the prehistoric counterpart of a mobile fortress and armored people carrier. And you knew the real battle was about to commence when one of these began to thunder toward the walls of your city. Siege towers were not inconspicuous. When utilized properly, they were large, audacious, and terrifyingly effective. The Greeks, particularly the Hellenistic nations, were the ones who carried the design to its most dramatic extremes, while the Assyrians may have been among the first to use them in the 9th century BCE. The Helepolis, or Taker of Cities, is a 9-story tower constructed by the Macedonian general Demetrius during the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE. Standing more than 100 feet tall, it was encased in iron plates, had catapults, and was pushed by thousands of warriors. It cracked under its own weight too, however the ambition. Unrivaled, the reasoning behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls are only effective if you are unable to overcome them. By providing a higher platform from which attackers might descend into the battlements, avoiding gates and climbing ladders, siege towers lost that advantage. While troops on the lower decks readied themselves to board, archers on the upper deck could shower death down upon defenders. However, these towers were not unbeatable. They were slow, susceptible to mud, and easy targets for defenders using rolling rocks, fire arrows, or even terrain that had been sabotaged. To halt a tower's approach, astute defenders would construct auxiliary inner walls, also called counterscarp defenses, flood moats, or dig ditches. Nevertheless, they produced amazing stuff when they did it. It was one thing to have a hole in the wall, but to have enemy soldiers suddenly swarm your own ramparts. It was anarchy. Siege towers made the battleground a vertical struggle for survival rather than a horizontal conflict of power. They turned height into both a strength and a weakness. There was no going back as the gangplank fell from a siege tower to the city walls. Hand-to-hand, horror was about to begin. Some of the most destructive siege tactics took place underground, in silence, while trebuchets soared and rams smashed. The evil skill of destroying a city by destroying the earth it stood on was known as siege tunneling, or sapping, literally. It was an old concept and horribly successful. Dig beneath the enemy's wall, use wooden supports to hold it up, and then burn those supports. The tunnel collapsed, taking the wall's base with it when the timbers burned away. Your city stood firm for a while. Then, like stale bread, a huge chunk of the outside wall fell away. This approach didn't seem very impressive. There were no loud launches or mighty engines. However, the slow, unseen death of fortress warfare was tunneling. Early forms of it were practiced by the Assyrians, but the Greeks, Persians, and later armies of medieval Europe perfected the method. When the Spartans tried to tunnel behind the walls during the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the defenders dug counter-tunnels and stopped them in their tracks, transforming the ground into a nightmare knife struggle. This defensive strategy, which came to be known as countermining, gave siege warfare a spooky touch. Imagine soldiers listening for the sound of enemy picks while excavating hundreds of feet below the surface in complete darkness. As soon as they heard tapping, they would rush to stop it, which frequently led to cramped, violent confrontations fought by torchlight using shovels and knives. It contained only fear, suffocation, and dirt, no grandeur. However, when undermining succeeded, the outcomes were disastrous. During the siege of Rochester Castle in England in 1212, one of the most notorious instances occurred. After tunneling beneath the southern wall, King John's army filled the mine with pig fat and lit it on fire. The entire tower above was brought down as the supports gave way. After being surprised, the defenders quickly gave up. By the 13th century, siege engineers were experts in spotting shaky foundations, gauging the behavior of the soil, and precisely planning collapses. They combined their skills as demolitionists and geologists. Tunneling also demonstrated one reality about siege warfare, despite the fact that it took time, effort, and a little bit of insanity. You could always take it down from below if you were unable to climb over or pass through the wall. The attackers did not cause all of the drama in siege warfare. Defenders had their own lethal tricks for each tower rolled forward or ram built, and sometimes those tricks were scorching. Let's begin with Greek fire, which is the most horrific of all. Greek fire was a mysterious napalm-like substance that was created by the Byzantines in the 7th century CE. It could adhere to people, walls, and ships, and continued to burn even on water. It produced scenes of utter mayhem when sprayed from siphons or thrown in clay pots. Nobody is certain how it was made to this day. The recipe perished with the empire since it was so secret. But what about its effects? Renowned. Within minutes, entire fleets were converted to burning skeletons, and that was only the beginning. Boiling liquids were the preferred weapon in lower-tech defenses. Murder holes, those charming holes in the ceilings of towers or entrances, would rain boiling water, oil, or sand straight down on intruders. Particularly dreaded was oil. In contrast to water, it adhered to skin, seeping into clothing and armor before being ignited. Imagine arriving at the top of a siege ladder to find yourself confronted with an unquenchable fire. Even though it wasn't as spectacular, hot sand was still terrible. It would slide into the openings in the armor, particularly around the wrists or neck, and boil the skin underneath, resulting in second- and third-degree burns. From a distance, it didn't appear impressive, yet in a matter of seconds, it transformed brave men into shrieking wrecks. The old-fashioned laws of physics were also invoked by the defenders. Gravity was turned into a weapon. Parapets were used to drop massive logs, stones, or even dead animals into dense infantry formations or siege engines. The objective was to simultaneously destroy the machines and morale, not only kill. Then there were spiked barricades, collapsed bridges, concealed pits and traps. Castles evolved into painful puzzles intended to punish, slow, and perplex. This was all done for the same reason. The threat of illness spreading in camps, the depletion of enemy supply lines, or the arrival of reinforcements increased with each minute a wall was held. In the attrition-based game of siege warfare, the defenders had ingenuity and a great deal of raging anger, while the invaders had the advantage of physics. Raw destruction was only half the aim of siege warfare. Before the walls were even taken down, the defenders' will was broken via psychological dominance. Siege weapons were enormous, creaking, burning icons of doom rather than merely being means of battle. The purpose of every groaning siege tower wheel and every arcing rock thrown by a trebuchet was to sow one seed in the thoughts of people inside the walls. You're not secure. Ancient leaders were aware of this. With a great deal of fuss, the Assyrians paraded their siege engines in the open. The Romans positioned their siege camps directly in front of the enemy, allowing the defenders to observe the assembly of battering rams and the testing of catapults. Fear was part of the script, and siege was theatre. Occasionally, a message was carried by the payloads themselves. Generals or messengers, frequently still in their armor, would have their severed heads hurled over the walls. In addition to rocks, bodies were also thrown upon the defenders during the siege of Constantinople. To spread pestilence and terror, diseased corpses were launched. It is thought that throwing bodies afflicted with plague over the walls of Kaffa during the Mongol siege in 1346 contributed to the spread of the Black Death throughout Europe. The trebuchet served as an announcement as much as a weapon. Everyone in the stronghold could hear the sound of one of these giants being rolled into position before they could see it. The hefty clunk of the counterweight, the grinding of the ropes, and the groaning of the winches all sound like the heartbeat of an impending storm. The most hazardous aspect, though, the unknown. You had no idea what would happen next. Would it be a rock, a fire barrel, a shower of arrows, or simply quiet? Heavy, foreboding quiet while engineers re-aimed. The noises even turned into psychological weapons. Defenders would get frantic with anticipation at the sound of a battering ram's rhythmic pounding or the abrupt hush before a shot. Convincing the enemy that resistance was futile, that their gods had deserted them, and that their fortifications were merely transient roadblocks in the course of fate were commanders' objectives. And the gates frequently opened without a struggle when that mental barrier eventually broke, because the mind would occasionally crumble in front of the stonework during siege warfare. Traditional siege engines came to a gradual and splintering end as gunpowder thundered onto the battlefield in the late medieval era. However, their legacy remained intact. It changed, everything changed when cannons were invented. What a trebuchet took hours to accomplish could be accomplished in seconds with a single well-placed shot from a cannon. Once thought to be impenetrable, stone barriers turned become liabilities. By the 15th century, iron balls falling through the parapets of Europe's great castles were causing them to collapse, not fire or undermining. The next round of siege warfare had begun, deafening, violent, and explosive. Nevertheless, the foundations established by the ancient siege engineers have endured. The catapult and trebuchet continue to be a source of inspiration for modern artillery. All long-range howitzers and ballistic missiles are only high-tech offspring of the same query. How can something that is supposed to be indestructible be broken at a distance? Centuries before gunpowder ever appeared in the narrative, physics, trajectory, tension, and force were all discovered, tried, and refined. Ancient siege techniques are the source of even modern military mentality, including shock and awe, overwhelming weaponry, and evident supremacy. The first shock and awe was those imposing siege engines rumbling forward with flags flapping in the breeze. They were about shattering the soul of a city, not just smashing through a wall. Their legacy is still visible in the remains of historic cities. At Masada, the desert is still scarred by Roman siege ramps. Layers of walls stood against every machine imaginable for a millennium at Constantinople until being finally pulled down by cannon fire. Round towers and angled bastions at castles around Europe depict a civilization that is continuously reinventing itself to withstand the next siege. And siege warfare still exists today, despite the advent of drones and satellite-guided missiles. It's now all digital. Defenders remain isolated, cities remain encircled, and walls have evolved into firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. However, the siege's essence has not changed. In order to win, one side is prepared to wait, build, and break, while the other side wants to keep them out. The spirit of siege warfare is as vibrant and destructive as ever, even though the battering rams and trebuchets are now museum items.